A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. I'm glad you're with us on the program today. And, you know, we could talk about a lot of things. We could talk about the package of gun control bills that apparently the fix is in. The votes are already there in New York State. We could talk about the House on Capitol Hill pushing a number of gun control measures. But you know how I feel about all of them, right? I don't think any of them would do any good at reducing violent crime. They would, however, do quite a bit of damage to our right to keep and bear arms. So if you want some in-depth discussion on some of the details of that legislation, I would encourage you to head to bearingarms.com. We will be covering those stories throughout the day on the website. But on today's Bearing Arms Cam and Company, I actually want to dig a little bit deeper. I want to do something productive. I want to talk about what we can do that doesn't involve going after guns or gun owners or the Second Amendment. What we can do to ensure that our kids are safe at school, because supposedly that's what all of this discussion is about, right? And yet it seems like there's very little discussion about how to actually do that. Instead, we're hearing a lot of talk about, well, we just had universal background checks. No, it wouldn't have applied in this case, but it might apply in another case. Stop. We're going to talk to James Eric Dietz. He is with the Homeland Security Institute at Purdue University. He studies this issue in depth, and he has done a lot of research over the years, again, on the most effective ways to protect kids and staff in schools. Take a look and listen. Dr. Dietz, thanks so much for coming on the program, sir. I apologize for the tech issues. We don't get to actually do this semi-face-to-face, but I think it's really important, as I said in the introduction to this program, that given the platform that I have, I don't just want to talk about the typical gun control debate, what we're seeing going on and play out in Congress and in the state capitals, because there really are substantive things that can be done to improve school security and school safety. And this is something that you've been working on for years there at the Homeland Security Institute at Purdue University.
We sure have. It seems that so much the debate is, two poles screaming at each other and not listening. And really, my research has been trying to focus on how do we better analyze those policy choices that we can make. So that way, when the choices are made, the outcomes are what we expect. We expect outcomes, for instance, in these school instances, to be safer places for children to learn. And so much of what's going on is not accomplishing that. And my research has been simply about, what's the value of a school resource officer? How do we compare that to other choices that might be made in the community?
So let's start there then, because this is something that, again, sort of plays out along political lines. There have been some cities that in recent years have, like Philadelphia, for instance, has taken steps to remove school resource officers from schools, believing that it makes kids fearful. It makes schools seem like, prisons. Those are some of the common objections, right? That school resource officers don't actually provide an extra layer of safety, but may make kids actually feel uncomfortable. What has your research shown about the value of having a school resource officer in place when one of these targeted school attacks happens?
Well, when the school attacks happen, the school resource officer, from our research that's been published in a number of places now, shows that we can reduce casualties by about 70%. Additionally, you can reduce casualties a little bit more by introducing concealed carry, even in small numbers in some of the classrooms. And we assumed a very conservative concealed carry estimate of, is many as 5%. But those teachers do not act like surrogates for law enforcement. They just protect the children in their classrooms, where they are at in particular. And that we were able to show can reduce casualties again by another 5 to 10%, depending on sort of the exact levels of carry and how many are there. The great thing about doing this in a modeling environment is we don't have to stress out children. We don't have to stress out parents or teachers, and we can test our policies over thousands of these active shooter events. So we can be pretty sure that we're making the best decisions we can for a particular community. Originally, our models were set up so that way you could actually go in and run the model with your school environment, your school policies to better understand, where you might be able to change outcomes, which is really what this, what good policy making about is. Let's change outcomes, particularly with school vulnerability of those school children. And the outcomes are changed by reducing response time, putting those school resource officers in the classroom, or actually allowing some of the teachers to defend themselves where appropriate, where they feel comfortable doing so.
And you just mentioned something really important, the response time. So if you've got a school resource officer on campus when an active shooter appears, and that school resource officer does not engage the attacker, obviously that's not going to be as effective, right, as immediately trying to engage and stop the threat, as we have seen in Uvalde, where there was, an hour-long delay from the time that the first 911 calls came in to the time that the door of that classroom was breached. This obviously plays a major role in terms of reducing lethality and saving lives as well, right? You can't wait around. You've got to engage as soon as possible.
Exactly. We want the school resource officer in the school, not spread between 2 or 3 or 4 or more schools. We want them in the school. So they're just a few minutes, or if not less, from the incident scene. And the faster that mitigation begins to occur, the fewer casualties we have. Our historical evidence shows that these shooters will shoot about three individuals a minute until either their mission is completed or they're engaged by somebody else with a firearm. Those numbers seem to bear out time and time again. Some a little faster, some a little slower, but this is a time game with average police response times in the country being in excess of 5 minutes, more commonly closer to 10 minutes. That's a lot of casualties that we stack up waiting on response to happen. So our work has showed that school resource officers are a great benefit if they're trained well and if they're going to take actions promptly and correctly.
And then when it comes to those armed school staff, it's interesting. There was a poll out by the Trafalgar Group asking Americans whether or not they'd be in favor of having armed teachers in public schools. They looked at, I think they talked to 1,091 general election voters, and 57.5% of them said that they believe that schools would be somewhat or much more dangerous without teachers who are legally carrying a firearm and are properly trained to use them. About 30% oppose that idea. And I think it's interesting that, obviously when we talk about things, we kind of talk about this at like a 50,000 foot level. But when you drill down and you're looking at, okay, again, what are those best practices for armed staff? You believe that the best practice would be for them not to actually assume that role of the school resource officer and to try to pursue and engage the attacker, but to sort of shelter in place with their students, but they are armed in case, again, that attacker breaks through the door, they can be met with an armed response. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And we felt that was appropriate given the general level of training of many with concealed carry. We did assume that the teachers that did carry would train with police in the area and would fire similar qualification tables to police. So they're making smart shots. But we also felt that there was a high probability that the police responding to the scene might confuse the teacher with the shooter because they're looking for a civilian with a gun. And we felt when we started the research that there would be much less, blue on blue or blue on, supporting blue if the teachers took that defensive position in the classroom. And if you look at that kind of policy over many events, not just one event where luckily or unluckily the shooter goes to a classroom that may or may not have an armed teacher that's ready to engage. But over many of events, it does drive down the overall casualty numbers to use that sort of policy. And we've actually seen some schools that have adopted just that kind of policy. They lock the guns in biometric safes. They make them available to a handful of trained teachers and administrators, and they provide that surrogate role for to supplement the school resource officer. Again, it's back to response time. Is when can you as quickly as possible engage that individual who's trying to harm the children?
Right. And again, I think it's important to know that there isn't necessarily, I mean, as you're indicating, there's not a one-size-fits-all policy. School districts can adapt to their own particular circumstances, right? So some districts might choose to have that staffer who's been, vetted and trained, have that firearm on their person. Other districts might say, listen, no, there's going to be a location where if something happens, you'll have access to a gun, but we don't necessarily want you carrying one around. These are all decisions that can be made by local school districts themselves. But the overarching policy of, hey, it would be a good idea to have at least some staff members trained up, that's sort of a starting point. And I'm curious, did your modeling look at what happened? Because you said you were talking about like 5% of the staff being armed. Did you look at what happened if it was, 15%, 25% of the staff members?
Yeah, we looked at 5 and 10,
okay.
and it scaled by proportion.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you 5 to 10, you increase the savings by that incremental amount, again, with a shelter-in-place strategy. And that was generally additive to the 70% that the school resource officer provided. And we also, at one point, we had the models adaptable, so you could put in this response time for your community. So we anticipated the idea there might be a community that just decides they don't want the firearms in the school, but they don't mind the officer in the parking lot, or they don't mind a modified patrol maybe near the school, which could have the same outcome, but not have the officer in the school. We have some urban areas with great vertical density, and the schools in those areas, there just might be more density of police. The response times are driven down because they don't have as far to go, but, depending on traffic and those kinds of things. So we anticipate that the model could be used to better inform the discussion between the school administration and between the responding police departments to make the best decisions for the school. Again, with the idea, how do we get the appropriate responder for that community there faster? And what risk are we taking? Obviously, we're not going to drive this risk to zero, but we darn sure should be driving it towards some sort of minimum that all of us can accept. This 20 and 30 students at a time is certainly something that we need to improve upon.
Absolutely. And again, I want to make sure I've got the numbers correct. Based on your research, your modeling, with a school resource officer in place, able to respond, with, let's say, 5% of staff being armed and sheltering in place with students, you said that the lethality of these types of incidents can be reduced by 70%. Was that the figure that you used?
Well over 70% just by the school resource officer. Wow. And another 10% depending on the concealed carry percentage.
Okay. Have you looked at, one of the other big topics of conversation outside of the, talk about gun control is physical security of the schools. We've heard a lot of talk about, well, maybe we need to limit the entrance points. Maybe we need to expand the exit points while limiting the number of places where people can get in. Have you done any research in terms of what we can do to harden up the physical security beyond school resource officers and armed school staff?
Yeah, we did that as well. We've had a couple of studies that we've done that kind of work. We've looked at the vestibules and the time the time cost to the intruder for having some of those obstacles. Just like my military time. We don't put obstacles on the battlefield because we think it's going to stop somebody. We just put the obstacles out to slow up the intrusion or the attacker. And so those ideas of adding vestibules, adding ballistic glass to those entrances slows up the intruder. if not stop or dissuade the intruder from actually, attacking the school. So those certainly can also add to that time. And you can come up with varied estimates of how much time it costs them. We looked at locked doors, generally costing about a minute. The vestibules, perhaps just slightly more than that, depending on the technology that's available there. Interestingly, we even looked at gunshot detectors in the schools, and we're able to show that just a simple gunshot detector in the school provided a considerable savings of life, because the gunshot detector is pretty specific to a firearm. It's also pretty infallible. It has very low rate of false alarms, false positives or negatives, and it basically gets the police moving as soon as the gunshot would happen. Frequently, we find with many of these active shooting events, especially if the staff are not really highly trained, it may take several minutes just to make that initial public safety access point or 911 call to get police rolling towards that site. And all that time is then available on top of the police response time if there's no resource officer in the school. So there are a number of kind of simple technologies that we have that can help reduce the casualties and improve the response. We also looked at grants. I'm in Indiana. Purdue University is in Indiana. We looked at some of the grants that were applied in Indiana to help provide for school security. And there's been millions of dollars offered to schools to do these things. And we found that there were really three buckets that money was being expended for. One, which was the lion's share of the money, probably a little over 50%, were to help fund school resource officers. The second was for construction, for technology, and for those armed vestibules, improving door entry, situations. That was maybe 40%, but amazingly, only about 5% was used for training. And that was really where we think some of the highest payoff gains can be found, is by making sure the staff, the students, the administration, and the police are all trained to respond effectively and quickly to this. We found by analyzing run, hide, fight, for instance, that sheltering in place in most situations is a poor strategy for, improving survivability. Sheltering in place, just as what recently happened in Texas, is generally or can turn out to be everybody who sheltered in place where the gunman ended up becomes a casualty.
Yeah.
And we really, I think, need to go back and revisit some of run, hide, fight and try to figure out that, it really ought to be, I would think, based upon our research, is maybe it's run, run, run. We hide when we can't run anymore. We fight if we really make a lot of bad decisions.
Yeah.
But the worst of the decisions would be the standard shelter in place, especially if it becomes, run, hide, fight, pick one. Shelter in place might seem to be the most logical, and that unfortunately is not one that has a great outcome, at least from what we've seen in modeling, and also from what we've seen with the alarming increase in these kinds of things. But we see it time and time again that shelter in place is not necessarily doing what we need it to do.
Unfortunately, you're right. And again, I think that gets back to response times. I would imagine it's even worse if you don't have a school resource officer in place, because then it's going to be, many more minutes before there is an armed response against that attacker. Dr. Dietz, listen, I could talk to you about this for hours, but I do appreciate you coming on the program today, and I look forward to having you back again very soon. I appreciate all of the work that you're doing here at the Homeland Security Institute at Purdue University to help improve school safety and ultimately protect our students and the staff at our schools.
Thanks, Cam. Thanks for allowing me to join you today.
Many thanks to Dr. Dietz for joining us on the show today, and we're going to have him back again in the near future, because this type of research just doesn't get talked about. And again, I think this is really important if the goal is to save lives and not just pass gun control so Democrats can say, look, we did something, quote unquote. Now let's turn our attention to today's armed citizen story, our recidivist report, and our good deed of the day. We'll start with our recidivist report from Ohio, where the ex-police chief in Addiston, Ohio, has been sentenced to 3 years probation for illegally trafficking machine guns. That's right, in federal court, mind you. While the Biden administration talks about the need to crack down on rogue gun dealers and to, go after folks who are breaking the law, here's what's actually happening with the Biden administration. You've got a former police chief who was involved in this scheme where he would buy machine guns. Yeah, real machine guns, not semi-automatic firearms, but actual full auto select fire machine guns for the Addison Police Department. Only he wasn't really buying the machine guns for the Addison Police Department. Instead, he would get these guns and he would turn around and resell them to a couple of gun dealers in Indiana, at times making 600% profit on these sales. Ultimately made about $11,500, I think. But the plan was to purchase more than 200 of these machine guns, prosecuted in federal court. And on Wednesday, judge hands down a sentence, 3 years probation, including 6 months home confinement. Basically, he's been grounded by Uncle Sam for 6 months. And what's amazing, I've got a piece at Bearing Arms. I wrote about this morning because it just drove me crazy. The ATF and the U.S. attorney are praising the sentence that this guy received. This is going to send a message. Is it? What message is it going to send, do you think? When you're eligible for years in federal prison and you walk away with 3 years probation, it does send a message. I just don't think it sends the message that supposedly the Biden administration is wanting to send to violators of our gun laws. So, again, rather than putting new laws on the books, new federal felony offenses, right? Why don't we take a look at what's actually happening right now? Because there is some serious rot that needs to be addressed. And if the goal were actually public safety, maybe the Biden administration would be looking into these things. But I don't think the goal really is public safety. I think the goal is more gun control. It's looking for that political win as opposed to real public safety. So, no, I don't expect that heads will roll at DOJ or ATF over this slap on the wrist for a machine gun trafficking scheme. Now, today's armed citizen story from Chicago. Don't have a lot of details here, but what we do know is that a Chicago man shot and killed a man who he found in his garage, who apparently confronted him with a knife. Police are still investigating, but Fox 32 in Chicago says it was around 2 p.m. Wednesday afternoon, a 36-year-old man inside his garage in the Logan Square neighborhood when a 53-year-old man armed with a knife approached him. That's when the homeowner pulled out a gun, shot the offender, who was pronounced dead at the scene. Victim did not sustain any injuries. Detectives are investigating, but again, at this point, it appears to be a case of self-defense. We will follow up with any details as they emerge. And finally today, our good deed of the day, Ocala, Florida, where 2 police officers in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing to save a little child, 6-day-old infant, from choking to death at a restaurant there in Ocala. Officers Michael Coughlin and Hannah Patterson were dispatched to a Golden Corral Saturday night. They got there just a little bit more than a minute after the call came in. Hannah Patterson said, all I could think about was the child. When the officers arrived, they saw people outside who were frantic. She said she was taken into the dining room where the mother was with her 6-day-old son. Patterson said the boy's mom almost ran by her, but she was able to stop the woman and take the baby from her. The child, who was born prematurely, had started choking while it was being fed breast milk. Hannah Patterson said she flipped the child on the back, put him on her left knee, had him on an incline so that whatever he was choking on would come up. At the same time, Patterson's patting the boy's back. She said he wasn't making any noise. He was purple. His eyes were shut. But after a moment, Officer Coughlin took over, followed the same procedure, and the child eventually responded to the treatment and started crying. Hannah Patterson says, I told dispatch he was awake and alert. Child was making noises. His eyes were wide open. Both she and Coughlin remained at the restaurant as EMTs made their way to the facility, took the child, began treating him, taken by ambulance to a local hospital, and apparently is going to be okay. thankfully. Hannah Patterson says, although she was nervous and felt pressure, her aim was saving the child's life. She said it was a sigh of relief when the baby started crying. So in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. Ocala, Florida officers Hannah Patterson and Michael Coughlin, we thank you for your very good deed. That is all we've got for you on this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. I mean, not that it was nothing, but I appreciate you being with us, and I look forward to seeing you again on Monday. Don't forget that we will be updating the website throughout the weekend at bearingarms.com with the latest Second Amendment news and information that you need to know about. And it is critically important to stay informed and engaged right now. If you like what you see, you can always become a VIP subscriber. Just go to bearingarms.com/subscribe. Use the promo code GUNRIGHTS, and you can get a significant savings on your VIP membership, which not only helps support the independent pro-Second Amendment journalism we're doing at Bearing Arms, but it's our way of saying thanks. Also allows you to get access to exclusive news stories, commentary, stuff you won't find anywhere else, because your support does matter. It does make a difference, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. So thank you very much. Have a good weekend. We'll see you soon. Until then, be well, be safe, and be free.